Well, thank you, Dr. Jeanne Sheehan Zaino, for being with me today on the Wave Capital's guest speaker series on relationship building in a team environment. You're my 93rd guest. How are you today, Dr. Zaino?
I am great, thank you, and 93, lucky number, and well, Garrett, you've done 93 of these, or 92, we'll see how this 93rd one goes. Congratulations.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate you being with me today discussing relationship building in a team environment, a topic I'm so passionate about. And I look forward to learning all about you and your professional career and why relationship building means so much to you. So my first question is essentially is what does relationship building mean to you and what is it meant for your professional career?
Yeah, it's such a fascinating question because, of course, I'm a professor and I also do a lot of work in media, and I'm also a fellow at a few organizations. And so, by nature, those are sort of solitary engagements. These are not, when you're a professor, you are certainly part of a department, part of a community, but you are not in a team in the way you would be at another organization. So, it's so fascinating that even with saying that relationships have been critical to everything I have done. I went to all public schools very proudly, including my PhD. I was not born having any contacts in the world I am in today. I was born in Connecticut. I didn't know anybody in the media in New York. All of this. And as I look back, it has all grown organically as a result of relationships. And so it is just critically important, and I think it's a skill that certainly we in the academy can do a better job helping students. I think are you a UNC alum? Go UNC, just an amazing school. And of course, higher ed is in host of changes are going on in higher ed, but I think this is an area and people certainly try to help people looking at going out in the world in any capacity understand the importance of that. Unfortunately, for many young people, it doesn't hit until they get out and realize, wow. But for me personally, it has all been built organically through relationships in every capacity of my life.
Well, that's wonderful to hear, and I love the fact that you have the Connecticut connection. I lived in Connecticut briefly when I worked at ESPN in Bristol, Connecticut, and, you talk about how important higher education is, and we're seeing a lot of reforms with education. Unfortunately, the dismantling of the Department of Education under the Trump administration has really, I believe, been taxing on a lot of people, knowing that they don't know how uncertain education will be at the federal level in this country, and will there be more states getting involved at a state level in terms of how they implement certain procedures or methodologies and how our children of the future are going to be educated. So, what are your thoughts on the recent dismantling of the Department of Education or the process in which that has been occurring now, this year under the second Trump administration? How concerned are you about that? And from a relationship building perspective, where we might see, it lacking in this administration?
First of all, go Bristol, ESPN. I grew up in Farmington, so right next door, and I'm a proud Husky. And of course, great basketball state there and in Connecticut. I think there is no question that at the federal level, just like at many of the state levels, we can do a much better job in providing services to people and to citizens. There is an enormous amount of waste. There is enormous amount of issues involving even basic things like moving records from paper in 2025 online. We don't have anywhere close to the kind of smart cities, smart communities in this country that, as the greatest country in the world, we should have. That said, coming in and breaking it is not going to get us there. And so I think that is the difference between, say, the Doge and even now with the shutdown, this approach. You have to be very careful to make sure whatever cuts you're making make sense for the American people. And that is where I think it is most troubling. the way in which it's been done. So it's not the goal. I think many of us agree on the goal. We need to streamline. We need to save money. We spend far too much money, but you have to do that carefully. And there are no shortage of great thinkers. And having been in DC, I know spending a lot of time in DC working on these issues of streamlining going back decades. There is a process by which we do that, and we do it with care because the federal workforce matters. Voluntary buyouts and retirements, that's a very good way to move forward. That makes sense, right? So I think it's not the goal, but it's the process by which we get there that matters. And, even just today, the president is just back, obviously, from his trip to the Middle East. He is going to be meeting with the president of Argentina. We are in the midst of a shutdown that is already in its second week, and the United States will give his close confidant and ally, the president of Argentina, $20 billion of US taxpayer money to bail them out. And you look at a shutdown, you look at the suffering going on with the American people, you look at a promise to make America great, invest in America, and then you look at that. And that is what frustrates so many people. And so, again, I think you look at the Department of Education, you have Linda McMahon as the secretary. She is a very accomplished businesswoman. She has been incredibly successful in her life. To come in with the goal of dismantling and not providing a vision as to what this can be going forward that makes sense in 2025 and going forward in the 21st century, that is what is troubling to me. Because as you said, we have so many challenges in education today, so many challenges in higher education. So that is troubling. On the plus side, I do think this is going to give the states a chance in a federal system to do the work that they need to do on their end to shore up education in this country. And that's not a bad thing. I say that as the proud granddaughter of somebody who was the head of the union for the Connecticut Education Association for decades. And state control of education, local control is something that many of us value. And so the federal government has a really important role in that. But this can also give the states the push they need not to be so reliant on the federal government. But you hope all of these changes, the children that are impacted are protected and cared for. And that doesn't seem to be the case at this point.
Yes, and it's very troubling. And I know that even at the university level, and we could talk about so many topics with how universities were targeted by the Trump administration or had been targeted by the Trump administration. What are your thoughts on how Ivy League schools have had to fight the Trump administration in courts and really stemming from the Trump administration standpoint of university presidents or chancellors or people who are running these universities where they are giving educations to people who are not obviously native to the United States, who are coming from other countries to go to school here. And yes, there have been protesting on college campuses and universities, but that's our First Amendment rights. Now, obviously, if they're breaking the law, if they're saying or doing things that go beyond free speech, of course, that they should be prosecuted. Of course, they should not be able to continue getting educated at these universities and colleges if they're disrupting academic life or they're harassing or targeting or speaking ill and threatening the lives of other students and not allowing them to get a quality uninterrupted education. However, there's always a way to do this in an orderly fashion, that you can't really look at it so broadly. You have to really look at it in various silos or in a vacuum where you just have to identify, in my opinion, the people who are aggravating or upsetting other students who are trying to get a quality education and figure out an orderly process to then have them answer to the court, so to speak, and to go through that legal process that we've been afforded for 250 years in our country. And I just think that the Trump administration, as you have seen, has tested the limits in terms of immigration or what we've seen in cities and federalizing cities with troops coming, the National Guard usurping governor's authorities and having even National Guard from Texas go into Illinois, and what we saw in California, what we've seen in Portland. So what we've obviously seen in DC, you and I have lived there. What are your thoughts on education from that standpoint, being that you're a professor, and also just from an immigration standpoint, because you can look at immigration and tie it to education, because we should, as a nation, attract the best quality talent, even around the world, not just here in the US, but it becomes a problem, what we see with ICE, what we see, people getting apprehended in their homes, at schools, on our city streets across America. So really like to get your feedback and your insight on that, and how troubling it is for you as a professor, where, and I don't know if you've experienced this, but whether it's you or other professors across the country, say you're teaching a student and ICE comes in and apprehends that student, that must, for some who have experienced that, that must be very jarring.
Absolutely. And, I would just take it as a political scientist from a global level. We are in a very multipolar, competitive world right now. We have left the moment behind at the, latter half of the 20th century when the United States had won, and I put that in quotes, the Cold War. And it looked like the destiny of humankind was democracies. That is long gone. We are in a competitive environment. And when you're in a competitive environment, you need to utilize all of your strengths. And amongst the number one strength of the United States has always been its great universities and research centers. I mean, there is a reason that Xi Jinping sends all his best and brightest to the United States to be educated. There is a reason that people are spending their young lives trying to get into these elite institutions from around the world. That is to our credit. If you just think of the competition with China, which is, the biggest competition we face, we cannot pretend to match them in terms of population and workforce. They are 10, 11 times bigger than we are. So that means we need to depend on alliances and we need to utilize the strengths that we have. And again, that is our universities. That is our educational systems. They are the envy of the world and have been for a long time. That doesn't mean they don't have problems that need to be addressed. Certainly, a lot of issues that need to be addressed. But again, you don't take a hammer to what is the most important of the soft powers that you have and try to destroy it by stopping people and students and young people from coming in. So that is one thing. People who care about the United States as the leading nation in the world, which I believe it is, who care about the future of democracy, who care about national security and our economic future. This is a source of it. It is a major source of it. So you need to protect that when you are given the opportunity to lead us. And so to see that attacked in this way is very troubling. That's not, again, to say, and to your earlier point, that there aren't challenges that need to be addressed at all these universities. That's absolutely the case. That's the case in any institution. That's the case in any organization. That's the case anywhere you gather large numbers of diverse people and have a community. And our universities, quite frankly, have done okay. We take in large numbers of diverse people who give back enormous amounts to the community. And we have issues, but those issues have been largely addressed and can be addressed if they're not. So to me, that is the overarching issue here. Immigration is a major issue in this country and has been. I always give as an example, go right back to the 2000 election. It's been a problem since before then. George Bush was elected, George W. Bush, on the promise to fix immigration because he was the governor of Texas. He knew how to handle the border. And then, of course, he was elected 9/11. You go forward, you look at Barack Obama, same promise. He wasn't able to do it. Donald Trump, I'll build a wall. He couldn't build the wall, or he built some of it, right? Joe Biden, and now Donald Trump again, right? We have a problem with immigration. You cannot have a safe, productive country if your border is not safe and contained and well maintained. You can't have a safe country if even the federal government can't tell you how many illegal immigrants are here. But there are ways, again, to handle these things. And I think some of this has to do with the mediated environment in which we live. You can't get attention in the media unless you say outlandish things. And so it's very much a culture and a mediated environment of we're going to do this and break this and handle. That's not the way you make productive change. And so getting back to the universities, immigration is a challenge. And we have to be very careful the way that we allow students in, and the universities have been. They do it with the federal government. But that's not, again, a reason to go in and to take this approach. And when it comes to the protests, you have First Amendment issues. And absolutely, we all know, going back to the Supreme Court cases from decades ago, century ago almost now, is that institutions are for education, and you don't have the same rights as a student or a faculty member in an educational environment that you do on the street. So yes, if you're going to disrupt education, you can be held accountable for that. But that's no reason to completely stop peaceful protests. And so there is a line there. Universities are well equipped to handle that line. And if they need the support of the federal government and federal officials, local state officials, they can bring them in. But there's no reason to go from 0 to 100 and destroy what is so critical to our future in these institutions. And so I'm a little sad that the universities haven't done a better job, because I think they felt protected for so long. And again, this is a silver lining to what Donald Trump has done, of saying, this is why we're valuable. We need to tell this story because people don't know it. If you haven't been at a university since you graduated, you may like your alma mater, but not think much about universities. Think about the amount of work they have done in everything from technology to medicine and health to public policy. I mean, the work is tremendous. A lot of it with taxpayer money. Let's celebrate that and move forward, not destroy it in the interest of quelling speech that we don't like.
Yes, and as you've been speaking, things are coming to my mind that I want to ask you about because I mean I agree with all points that you're making. I believe that when it comes to immigration, although it was 2.5, 3 years late, I was very encouraged that the bipartisan border deal last year was negotiated between Democrats and Republicans. And the fact that you could have had a solution that was bipartisan, but because it was an election year and, President Trump worked with Mike Johnson and didn't want that bill to pass under the Biden administration. So Donald Trump had that to run on, which obviously is disingenuous, but there are more words I can think of that are stronger than the word disingenuous. But I mean, it was absolutely wrong. It was someone who was for personal gain and someone who is looking to be reelected and someone who is trying to escape a lot of legality of cases where that could have potentially, although probably we wouldn't have seen the first president go to prison or a former president go to prison. I do think that we have a president who was able to escape what he did on January 6th, his contribution on January 6th, and then pardoning over 1,500 criminals really on January 6th. And then you think about other cases that, he was very much involved in and that was really played out throughout all media channels and that we came to learn about the classified documents case and the election subversion case in Georgia and, the case with Alvin Bragg in New York. But what I'm trying to say is that if we would have, with respect to immigration, if we would have had that bipartisan border deal go through, I don't know how much of that would have changed the election or swayed it one way or the other, but it would have been one less thing that we could have focused on, this year. Because I think that it incentivized the Trump administration to carry out Project 2025 policies where you have ICE and other officials who are really in such an Orwellian or draconian type of way, we're really going back to pre-1960s, and Governor Newsom has talked about it, and other governors have talked about it, where from the standpoint of how they're going about this immigration fight, but then in terms of just freedom of speech and civil rights and liberties, and people feeling that they are alone. They're alone in terms of how are we going to afford groceries? How are we going to buy a house? How are we going to get a quality education? How are we going to be able to afford our health care? How are we going to be able to survive in an economy that was stable and doing very well under the Biden administration? And really, the golden age with the Trump administration, it hasn't come yet. I don't believe it ever will come. I think that the economy is suffering, and I think that inflation is still too high. And I do believe that higher education learning is really only for the privileged. Yes, there are community colleges. Yes, there are trade schools. There are people who are starting businesses and trying to determine in their early to mid 20s, let's say, are we entrepreneurs? Can we start our own business and not have to rely on, working for an employer who might have only a few spots available for us to then get hired and then move up the corporate ladder, so to speak. So I just think that we have seen also that under Republican administrations, the economy does worse than Democratic administrations. And that is a fact. There's a lot of studies and there's a lot of work that has been cited that under Democratic administrations, the economy does so much better. However, it could be disguised, right? After a pandemic, it can be disguised where we had supply chain disruption. We had a lot of jobs that had to then be given, or bounce back jobs, however you want to deem it, that people were able to then get back. Maybe not necessarily the ones that they had before the pandemic, but there are still a lot of people hurting. And so, from your standpoint as a political science professor who speaks, at Bloomberg or on Bloomberg News, I've been interviewed on Bloomberg Radio before, and you're involved with the Harvard Kennedy School and other organizations. What are your messages to younger people who are really worried about a whole host of issues and feel that this administration, just like the first administration, they are always in the news. You're always hearing about different legal issues and going up to the Supreme Court to try to, figure out how to be catering to this administration. We're seeing a very partisan Supreme Court. So for a lot of young people who are hopeless and not knowing how are they going to make it to the next day, or elderly population who might have very well their health care taken away from them because of this government shutdown. When you don't have air traffic controllers, basically monitoring our skies. I was in California last week. My wife and I were in Southern California celebrating our, fifth wedding anniversary. And we were flying out of John Wayne Airport in Orange County. We flew into LAX. We didn't fly to Burbank, but Burbank had no air traffic controllers, right? And that's a big issue. The military was only able to get paid because the Pentagon had to allocate funds. The funds had to be moved around to pay our troops, this time. But how concerned are you? And I know it's a very broad and very open-ended question, so feel free to answer in however you prefer in some of the things that I just shared. But how concerned are you, given that you and I and others, we study this every day?
Yeah, first of all, congratulations on your fifth wedding anniversary. And I did hear about the closure in Burbank, and there was the release of some of the eerie reports from the ground telling the pilots in flight that the airport was shut down. And you could hear the pilots saying things like, is this because of the government shutdown? It's just very eerie and very scary and incredibly disruptive. I guess a few things come to mind. One thing is that, as you mentioned, I spend a lot of my time at Bloomberg, the biggest and best news organization. I've been at a lot of them, and Bloomberg Radio, where you've been on, which is the best radio station out there. Big plug for Bloomberg Radio and, of course, TV. We've spent a lot of time at the end of the Biden administration, but probably throughout all 4 years of the Biden administration, talking about this divide. And it is a divide between the actual numbers regarding the economy and how people are feeling on the ground. And the Biden administration folks for a while would just express frustration that the economy is doing better. We're doing better than most of the economies in the world. But why aren't people feeling it? And The reality is I mean, I'm a pollster. You cannot talk people into feeling something, right? I always say it's sort of like if you want to date somebody and they don't want to date you, you can't say, no, you'll really like me. They don't like you. They don't want to date you. Same thing. So trying to understand that divide has been a long-term challenge, and we see it in other ways as well. That's the economic divide. But one book that I just read that I would recommend is a book called Outclassed by Joan Williams, who I have challenges with the book, but I am a big fan of hers and this work. And one thing she does brilliantly is she tells people on the left and Democrats where you've gone wrong over the years. And so it's a very involved thesis she has, and it's very important. And she gives really practical advice. But the reality is that Republicans have been much better able to appeal to a constituency and a group that used to be part of the Democratic fold, and that is the working class. Interestingly, not those living in poverty or the poor, which neither party seems to be focused on. It is the working lower middle class. Those people who have jobs, who are living paycheck to paycheck in many instances, and feel incredibly vulnerable in this environment. And that's hence her term outclassed. But it is, I think, a really important reminder for people on the left and Democrats that this problem that we are seeing now come to fruition predates Donald Trump by a very long time, well before 2016. And so that's one reaction I have. And so I do recommend that text. The other thing I would say, you started by talking about the bipartisan immigration bill, and even the Wall Street Journal described it as the strongest bill we had seen in a long time. And, it had, as you noted, a lot of support on both sides of the aisle. Clearly, it was not something that the president was going to support as candidate, and it was killed. I think one way to look at this question from another perspective is what is wrong with our Congress? Not what's wrong with our Congress people, because this is not about people. And this gets much closer to my work. That we spend a lot of time. I was just at a rally this weekend talking about Donald Trump. And my reminder to people is always you've got to remember that this is nothing to do or doesn't have as much to do with Donald Trump or even the Republican Party today or any group. These are long-term structural problems that have to be addressed. And so I would say the same thing about that bill. It wasn't the first bipartisan immigration bill, as you well know. Going back decades, we've seen bipartisan immigration bills come forward only to die a sad death. Why is that? That has more to do with James Madison than it does Donald Trump. And so if you want to make real change, sure, go out and advocate for the candidate of your choice and go out and advocate for a party of your choice. But that's not enough until and unless you make structural changes to the system and support people who are working on those kinds of things. All of this changing of whoever is on top will not amount to anything. Because if not for Donald Trump, somebody else is going to come in and fill that seat. And trust me when I say they can do a lot more damage than he's done already. And it can be a lot worse on the ground. I always think of, I don't know if you're familiar with philosopher Slavoj Žižek, who's, just an amazing public intellectual and has been around a long time. But after the BP oil spill, which we all remember was so devastating, this was during Barack Obama's presidency.
It was right around the time I graduated from UNC.
Yes, right? So you were down south at least. I was up here.
I remember watching the big screen TV in the lobby of our Husband School of Journalism and Media, and it was right around the time I was graduating. I was literally watching all the media coverage. So I remember it was 2010.
Yeah, and it was horrific. I mean, it was so devastating and still is devastating. What are we, 15 years or so later? It still has had devastating environmental impact. But Slavoj Žižek wrote this piece, and it was something like, "Give BP a break." And a lot of people looked at that piece, just looking at the title, because a lot of people don't read below the title, and said, why should we give this big oil company who's destroyed this environment a break? But as you read further, Zizek's point was so important. He was critical of the Obama administration and others who were solely focused on holding BP and its operators responsible in court. Because this sort of idea of legal culpability, yes, they're culpable. Yes, they should be held responsible. But that is only the tip of the iceberg. If you really want to make change, you need to dig deeper and figure out why we as a nation are so dependent on these big oil companies that we put ourselves in a position to have this destruction at the hands of BP. And he makes a point in there, which is so true. If it wasn't BP, it would have been another oil company. So merely holding them culpable legally is not enough. And, I use this to make the same case you mentioned earlier, the J6 case. Yes, hold these people accountable. Yes, try them, hold them legally responsible, but that's not enough. We also, as a country, have to understand and try to understand better what caused so many Americans to be so frustrated on January 6th that they went on this attack against their own U.S. Capitol. If we don't understand that and address the root causes, it'll happen again and again and again, because as we all know, history repeats itself in other forms. So that is one thing I would say about the immigration bill as well. Yes, frustrating it didn't get passed. Why didn't it get passed? It's not only because of Donald Trump. I hesitate to blame people for doing things that most humans do. And when you're running for president, you better want to win. And you better expect people running with that much ego and that much interest at stake to do everything they can to win. And so we can't be surprised that he wants to kill a bill like that. We have to think about, where has our electoral system, for instance, gone wrong that it allows this? Where has our congressional system, the way we structure Congress, gone wrong? So there's a lot of structural, institutional aspects of this that aren't nearly as exciting or sexy or interesting, that need to be addressed if we want to make real change. So those two things come to mind.
Yes, and you make very interesting points. And, a couple things that popped out to me is that, and you talk about January 6th, and I had brought up
Yeah.
January 6th, that is it fair to say from your standpoint? I mean, from my standpoint, I believe that January 6th happened because President Trump was a big instigator. He said that, we're going to try to fight for this election. We're going to, stand up, because I think his words were like, we're not going to have a country anymore if we don't fight for this election, and we should march down to the Capitol. But there was no marching down to the Capitol. There was an invasion of our Capitol, and police officers died from their injuries, and a lot of PTSD and damage to the Capitol. I mean, they were essentially insurrectionist, American style coup from within, having people who are American citizens who are supporters of only Donald Trump, and they weren't supporters of obviously Joe Biden. The fact is that when President Trump was saying, this election was stolen, it was rigged, it wasn't a fair election. And then we all see how Fox News is being sued for $787 million by Dominion, right? I mean, that's a whole separate discussion. But from your standpoint, don't you feel that January 6th happened because the leader at the time, who's now the leader again, riled up his base, riled up his supporters, because he sold them on a lie that our election of 2020 was stolen, that Biden was not duly elected, and that he was not the president elect, and that really Donald Trump won the election. And that really goes back to what I was saying about the election subversion case in Georgia, where he's on and a recording trying to find 11,000 or so votes, and trying to flip Georgia, and also seeing that Arizona went blue that election cycle too. So that's one question I have for you, because it just seems so glaringly obvious to me that, and I'm sure many others, but then again, that's where that division comes from, because then people look at January 6th totally differently. But if the Republican Party is the law and order party, why is it okay for the president of the United States, who got reelected, to pardon over 1,500 criminals, to basically give them a pass and calling them hostages, right? And that they're patriotic, and that I just find that to be insulting, honestly, to, not only just half the country who support the Democratic Party, but even moderate Republicans and people who have supported Donald Trump. I mean, they really condemned what happened on January 6th. I mean, Mitch McConnell and others condemned what happened on January 6th and said that President Trump was responsible for that happening from the standpoint of riling up that base. Because if when he lost in 2020, he could have said, yes, I lost. I'm going to be gracious and have President-elect Biden come to the White House and have this peaceful transition of power. But it was not a peaceful transition of power. And so that really concerns me, that now that that precedent is out there. And so when you talk about the structural changes, I think that we've seen in Congress, and yes, I do believe that just the way that our country was founded, we have three co-equal branches of government, but now we're seeing each branch of government, depending on an election cycle or depending on something that we can't control, like a natural disaster, or something that's policy related, whether or not the Democrats or Republicans are in control of the House, Senate, or the White House, the Supreme Court. So it's almost as if, like, now we're seeing what we're seeing with gerrymandering, that now states want to gerrymander and redistrict because, President Trump, I believe, I see the polls, you're a pollster, a lot of Republicans blame Donald Trump for the shutdown. You blame the Republicans, not the vast majority, but it's well over 50% of people who are blaming the Republican Party for the shutdown, and that they don't want to see their health care become so expensive. Premiums, go from $600 to, let's say, $4,000, as Senator Kelly from Arizona was saying, that you might see Arizonans see their premiums go sky high. And that's why the Democrats are feeling that if a shutdown didn't happen, that we would have, as Americans who rely on Obamacare for that to occur, but also going back to Congress, that we saw during the Reagan years and we saw during the Clinton years, that you could have friendships be made in Congress. You would see Democrats and Republicans work together. That although they had political differences and they had different, policy prescriptions, that they were, still respectful representatives and senators of our two-party congressional system of House and Senate. And now, really, since the Bush years, when the Tea Party movement started to form, pre-Make America Great Again movement, and that separated from the traditional conservative. And when I say traditional conservative, talking to Chuck Todd, who we know very well, he said traditional Republicanism in the sense of the 20th and now 21st century, from, Dwight D. Eisenhower to George W. Bush. It was a lot different before previous Dwight D. Eisenhower era, but that we're now seeing the Tea Party movement become the Make America Great Again movement, and that is the Republican Party so fractured. And yes, to say the Democratic Party can be fractured as well, far left progressives versus, more moderate Democrats who could then probably share the sentiments or the policy prescriptions of even moderate Republicans. But has the Make America Great Again movement, although transformative in the sense of, if that's what you believe and if that's the party you subscribe to, transformative where Donald Trump had no prior political experience, no prior military experience, first president in history to not have both, that we're now seeing a Make America Great Again movement where it may and most likely could outlast Donald Trump's tenure. But this idea that this far right MAGA positions, that there really is no room for compromise. There really is no room for having bipartisan support, because the moderate Republicans of the Mitt Romney and the John McCain eras are no longer present. So I would love to get your thoughts on that, because I do worry that although there are far left politicians like Bernie Sanders or AOC or Elizabeth Warren, or you're seeing now Mamdani, who's running for mayor in New York City, I don't look at the far left the same way I look at the far right. I look at the far left as, okay, they might have this non-capitalistic mentality, and everything is more entitlements and everything is more free, so to speak, and there's less entrepreneurial spirit of how this country was founded. But then again, from a political perspective, I think that far left and moderate Democrats are going to agree a lot more than who are considered to be moderate right versus the MAGA right. So I would love to get your thoughts on that.
Generally, I go with a couple rules. Number
Yeah.
one, I hesitate to look back in the past and say, wow, things were a lot better. It's very common for us as human beings to look back and say, whoa, these politicians were so much better and were willing to cover. And sure, things ebb and flow. We've had periods when we've had people of one ilk or another, but, I spend a lot of my time at the founding. See, I have my James Madison Montpelier Cup here. Um,
Yes.
and they were vicious to each other. And there is no question about that. The early American public officials were vicious. They were vicious politically, they were vicious in the media, they were vicious in Congress. So I believe that human beings are what they are. And I'm not one of these people who believes that we are getting better and better as human beings by nature. And so for me, you never want to construct a government where you're just hoping that the best of us rise to the top to run the thing. You want to compose a government. So even if you get average people like me in there, smart, not smart, good hearted, not good hearted, ambitious, not, that the thing is not going to collapse under the weight. Right. And this gets back to James Madison and Federalist 51 when he talks about the fact if we were angelic, you wouldn't need government. We need government because people by nature are not angels. And so the government is there to set up a structure in which even the non angelic among us, if we're in a Republican system or a Democratic system where people rule, can rule and they can do so, but not become tyrannical. So I say all that because when we think about things like the Republican Party, the Democratic Party, Donald Trump, Joe Biden, whoever it is, there was a time when the Republican Party was the party that was anti-slavery. There is a time when the Democratic Party was the party of the South and a one-party state, ambitious in many ways. These are groups made up of people. And so they have had their, what I would think personally as bright spots and very dark spots in a long history. I don't know if the MAGA movement survives Donald Trump in the way it's constituted now. I think we're all waiting. But when you look at questions as to would January 6th have happened in the absence of Donald Trump? Certainly not, I can guess, not the way it did. But I think the more important question is you need to guard yourself for if a Donald Trump like figure gets into these positions because he did so legally. He did so constitutionally, right? He became president. If somebody like him gets in, how do you guard against something like that, right? And that to me gets down again to the systematic structural components. Everything he has done right now, as far as I know to this moment, not everything, most things in Donald Trump 1.0 and 2.0 have been constitutional, objectionable, but constitutional, right? He hasn't yet, for instance, defied a federal judge's order. If he does that, you can argue he did, he didn't, but so far it has mostly been constitutional. So what is most shocking to me are the things that are allowed legally. And all of this has been allowed. And so I think the broader question is not would this happen with or without Donald Trump, but what happened that got so many people so frustrated at our government? And you see, there's an elitist component of this conversation when it focuses all on the top Donald Trump, Joe Biden. I spend, as you know, and my days in the media. I'm on Bloomberg every day. And it is much more interesting as a human being to focus on, oh, Donald Trump did this, or, Mike Johnson did this, or Chuck Schumer said this crazy thing. I'm in New York. Chuck Schumer's always saying crazy things, right? It's much more interesting to talk about truths and tweets. We also need to look at what I'm going to call the bottom. And I don't mean the bottom in a derogatory way. I mean the masses, all of us, right? And we don't, in a media component, because we're in a capitalist system, we need ratings, we need viewers, we need readers, we need to focus on the much more exciting. For researchers, we've got to also focus on what's going on in the masses. And so for me, when I think about January 6th, it's less about Donald Trump and his culpability. And if you're culpable, absolutely, the law should hold you accountable. But what is it that has these people so frustrated or so riled up or so feeling left out? And that goes back generations, right? I mean, we're talking on Zoom right now. We are all facing a world in which AI is coming for our jobs, and it's coming fast and it's coming swift. The difference is for people in one level and strata of society, the impact is going to be there, but it's going to be far diminished from other people whose jobs are being completely destroyed. And when nobody is talking to you about that, you can damn well bet that you're going to be frustrated. And when you are at this level, I'm Irish and Italian. We all know as these immigrants come in, they're battling with other immigrants. Why? Because there's a very small economic pool and jobs available. And so you're going to fight for your family and your territory. That's human beings, and right, we should. So I think to me, the question is, what happened? And where did we go wrong? And how can we do better? And so again, I spending my time in the media know these are not the most exciting conversations to have, but those are the questions we need to address in addition to holding people accountable legally and all those things. So, do I think Donald Trump has had a lot to do with this? Absolutely. But I also think that there are other groups who we should focus at least some attention on. And, I also think that Donald Trump and the way that he has proceeded, he has been able to make a case that a lot of people agree with, that it doesn't matter if you're a Republican or Democrat. When you were at the top, whether you were, Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump, the way in which that you had operated and you had benefited from your position was very objectionable to many people, right? And some of that goes with the territory, but there's a real anger there. So that's sort of a long-winded way of saying that I for me, that's where I like to focus my attention, because when Donald Trump is long gone, people will still remain and they will still be moved by populist demagogues who could be even more dangerous or equally dangerous. And so, unless you address what happened in a concerted and structural and institutional way, it's bound to happen again, because Donald Trump is, for all he likes to say about himself, he is not an anomaly. There will be another Donald Trump, and it could be worse.
And we pray that's not the case. And we pray also for people who are really struggling and hurting right now. And I really think that if Joe Biden was a younger man and he was somebody who, during his vice presidency years, if he was at that stage in his life running for a second term, I think that this whole media landscape of how, especially on the right, of how they portrayed him as someone who cognitively couldn't run the country. I know that he, with advanced age, and sure, people slow down, especially late 70s going into the early 80s. But I do believe that the media fabricated or manufactured a narrative that, although you can point out that, okay, he's not doing enough press conferences, or he's not at the podium in the press briefing room, right? And he's not as visible as previous presidents were. I do believe that from a legislative standpoint, he accomplished a lot. And he has 50 years of experience. And although he has a team around him, it was one signature win after another. Now, if you're a Republican, you might think that what Joe Biden and the Democrats and whomever they were able to get on the Republican side, moderates, to help them with their bipartisan, initiatives and legislation to pass. But key piece of legislation from infrastructure, Inflation Reduction Act, or gun safety legislation, or protecting veterans who were exposed to toxic burn pits, and things that you could look back on and say, well, he really accomplished those things. He got us out of the pandemic. And yes, Operation Warp Speed happened under the Trump administration, but while Operation Warp Speed was happening, you heard again, that Trump, he would publicly say it, right? And then it was exposed in the Bob Woodward tapes that he knew COVID was bad. He knew that people were getting sick from something that was not going to go away, that it was real. It wasn't a hoax. It wasn't a fairy tale, right? It really was happening, and telling his constituents that COVID would just go away and let's not focus on it, when in fact he had the knowledge knowing that it was here to stay for, and we saw for another 2, 3 years in its present form. And so I look at how the election of 2020 happened and why Joe Biden got elected, because he came in as a more compassionate person. He came in as somebody who really wanted to make sure, with his small town Scranton, Pennsylvania values, that, hey, we can get out of this. Where our best days are ahead of us. I truly believe the messaging that he had, and it resonated. And I think where it went wrong, to your point with the Democrats, is because coming out of a pandemic, once in a 100-year pandemic, and even with all these legislative wins, to your point, why are people still not feeling those wins? Why are people still not feeling it in their pocketbooks of having extra money for, their children's schooling, or paying bills, or going to the grocery store, and having affordable gasoline, putting gas in their cars? And I do think that we also live in a society where it really does take a 2 terms of any president to feel those effects. And so 4 years of Donald Trump, I thought they were chaotic. I believe that they were chaotic 4 years. I thought that the Biden 4 years, although no person is perfect, I really think that we accomplished as a nation a lot under the Biden years. And I think that why President Trump saw an opening to get reelected and to escape all of the litigation against him and all these cases against him, is that he figured that that narrative of Joe Biden being too old, and Trump really putting it out there that there's cognitive decline and he's not capable, and saying he's the worst president who ever lived. And his base really stuck to that because they really felt that, okay, let's, in their mind, how bad could it be? But they forgot that it wasn't that great in the previous 4 years with Trump, and that they were so desperate to make sure that, can we take care of ourselves? Can we take care of our families? Can we, really sustain our livelihoods? But if you look back at what Biden was able to do, our economy is so worse off. You talk about what he's doing with Argentina. I mean, giving a $20 billion line of credit to his friend who runs Argentina, when Rahm Emanuel said, others have said that 20 million people can lose their health care and it could be unaffordable. And so that's not the only thing that Donald Trump is doing. He's making a lot of money and profiting off the White House, whether it's with cryptocurrency, or whether he's doing deals in the Middle East, or doing deals with other countries, and whether it's hurting American farmers here at home. It's like he ran on a platform of America first, right? And we're going to make America great again. But how could you say that when hundreds of thousands of people have lost their job in the federal government, that there have been now more federal layoffs because of the government shutdown, that the Make America Healthy Again with RFK Jr., unlike his father and uncle, who was Robert Kennedy and John Kennedy, if they were alive today, knowing that they were so science focused and they were so environmentally focused and sound people, that to see that one of their offspring, if they were alive today, to be able to not promote vaccines because that it might cause autism, when there's no fact-based evidence that vaccines cause autism. Or now with Tylenol during pregnancy, my wife and I are expecting our second child March 21st, 2026, and our medical doctor, right, says that there's no evidence that Tylenol will hurt your child during pregnancy. And now with the second child on the way, talking to my doctor, she's concerned that because I'm in the state of Florida, and because of Governor DeSantis and the Florida Surgeon General, they want to change the way vaccines are administered, making them optional, maybe perhaps changing the vaccination schedules, where if my children are fully vaccinated in school, but they're with kids who are not vaccinated, it takes the efficacy and reduces it dramatically with the vaccines that are in my children. And then you're seeing a lot of cases in Texas or Florida where people are dying from measles, and measles was eradicated years ago. So I'm concerned that, okay, you could talk about Donald Trump or Joe Biden, but it's also about the people you put in your administration. It's all, you mentioned Linda McMahon, but although to your point, and I think it goes without saying, yeah, she is an accomplished businesswoman. But just because you're an accomplished businesswoman, or in a lot of people thought Donald Trump was an accomplished businessman, but he had six bankruptcies in his life. And I'm coming from the private sector in my previous role in investment banking for over 8 years. I came across people who had worked with Donald Trump at one time or another, or had heard that from others who had worked with him personally, where they were cheated out of business deals and where they were affected and where their contractors weren't paid and things of that nature. So it's like, it really is all interpretation, or it's all about perception, where you might think, okay, they might not have to be angelic to run the country. However, I think that the standards have now changed from a political standpoint, where people in politics are now held to a different standard than people in corporate America. Because in corporate America, they want the best and brightest. Universities want the best and brightest. There are standards of measurement to get into the best schools, and there are standards of measurement to work with the best corporations. But then why can't we hold those same standards of measurement in politics with our congressional members, whether Democrat or Republican, where we are now saying, like, well, if the country can still run somewhat effectively, it doesn't have to be perfect. But if we held the same standards in politics as we do in higher education, as you are a professor, because as a professor, Dr. Zano, that who does exceptionally well in your class and who is just getting by, or a mediocre student. Well, corporations judge their people as well, and they're going to only offer jobs to the people who they perceive to be the most qualified based upon their resumes or prior experience. And yeah, there are times where it might not be a good fit and the person wasn't the right person for the job. And 6 months or 12 months later, they're on to their next assignment. But same thing with education. So I feel that, politically speaking, we need better leaders. And I never questioned the leadership of Joe Biden. I never questioned the leader of Barack Obama. And to some extent, I never questioned the leader of George W. Bush, because I felt that they were career politicians who understood how politics work. And then they just pulled in the right people from the private sector when they had to make decisions that were either business focused or economics focused, or they have to consult with the top doctors and surgeons in this country, or medical researchers when it came to health care policy, or the top professors or university leaders and higher education leaders when it came to education policy. But I just feel like in the Trump administration, like the first one, you don't have that same standard, because you're pulling a lot more people from the private sector thinking that business minded people know how government works, but they really don't. So, and I think it could be said for both sides. You could say if you're too career political focused or politically focused, you're a career politician, you may lack certain business sense or knowledge. But then if you're too business minded, you're too business focused, then you might lack the knowledge of how Congress works, or how to get a productive administration to pass a lot of key pieces of legislation that not just benefits your party, but benefits people across the board. So there is that middle ground. And that's what the American people want to see. And I'm sure you believe that the vast majority of people really are independently focused, but we have a two-party system and you can only really vote Democrat or Republican. The third party group really, right? Unless you're Ross Perot, the third party nominee, or the third party candidate, I should say, who's never been a nominee, they have not been as successful. So I would love to know also, from your point or from your standpoint, how do we, and I've had these conversations as well with people, how do we get it where maybe the third party candidate is more relevant too? Where one day in the future, we might see a third party candidate become president, but I don't see it today.
Even if you're Ross Perot, it doesn't help with all those millions. I'm at the Ash Center at the Harvard Kennedy School, and the focus there is on reimagining democracy. And that's something I think that we should all think about. Just because the framers made decisions in 1787 and 1789 does not mean we have to continue to live this way. And almost every example you gave, appointees of President Trump or any president, the two-party system versus a multi-party system, a presidential system versus a parliamentary system, the fact of 2 4-year terms. These are either built into the Constitution as a result of an agreement made, or they've evolved over time, but they can all be changed. And so that is one thing I would say about that. Now, to your point, changing the two-party system to a multi-party system, very, very tough to do in the United States. Can it be done? I think it can, but it's not going to happen in the short term. That's quite frankly why Donald Trump decided to run in the Republican Party versus a third party run. Even people as, charismatic as Teddy Roosevelt have not been able to make that happen. It is very, very tough to do in this environment. But we can reimagine the system. And every one of those examples you gave again are things that are constitutional or legal, right? Who the president appoints and who the Senate confirms. We may not like RFK, but there he made it through the gauntlet, right? The same thing you could say about any of the cabinet members. All of these things can be reimagined. And, while you were talking at the beginning of your question about the issue of Joe Biden's legislative agenda, he absolutely succeeded well beyond anything legislatively any of us imagined when he ascended to the office. But let's remember how he did it. He did it on and with the support of people like Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema. And the Democratic Party has turned their backs on those folks, right? And so, by the way, the Republican Party is starting to do this to their moderates, right? That's how parties operate. But all of those wins came because the party was able to come together and they were able to give enough to Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema to get those over a very close line because it was closely divided then as it is now. And so it is devastating to see that they have turned their back on people from states like West Virginia. And I don't mean turned our back, but I mean not has been as open to the fact that Joe Manchin coming from West Virginia is dealing with people with very different concerns than I am sitting here in Southern New York, right? Or you where you are in Florida or somebody in those concerns are very different. So to me, that again is a structural problem of our party system. It deals with issues like gerrymandering. It deals with issues like money and politics. When we're talking about things like the media, why does the media operate this way? Because they are incentivized in a capitalist system to do that. We don't have to do that. We could have some public media that, as you know, has just been completely or almost defunded in this system. That's horrifying because you look at Europe, they have a vibrant public media. People, I get, don't want to spend tax money on a media environment that they think is partisan to the left or right. But the reality is we're getting the media we get because they are in a capitalist system. They have to play to people and they will play to the lowest common denominator for ratings and money. They have to keep their jobs. So all of these are structural issues that can be reimagined. But until we do that, again, it almost doesn't matter who comes in and who comes in. And I know you mentioned George W. Bush. I'm old enough to remember, and you're a lot younger, but you remember how low his approval ratings were when he left office. People said the worst. Well, now we've had sort of a new look at George W. Bush. That'll probably happen with Donald Trump, although it's hard for people to imagine that now. But the problems themselves will persist. And so that's where I think at least some focus or support for people, and there's a lot of them doing good work on reimagining the system. And one that we haven't mentioned is the Electoral College. How does Donald Trump get in? Because we have an Electoral College. James Madison didn't support that. Most members of the founding didn't support it. It was an agreement they made as a result of a compromise to get this thing over the line. People have been working for years to reimagine how that could be restructured to all of our benefits. So there's work out there to be supported to make a difference long term. And also, of course, go out and fight to change your party and to get your candidates elected. That matters. But to me, it matters equally that you fight to restructure the system.
Yes, and to the points of not only redistricting mid-decade opposed to every 10 years when the census comes out, but we're seeing Democratic states and Republicans-led states
Yeah.
redistrict because they get a sense that Donald Trump's approval ratings are plummeting and that the policies are not popular even amongst his constituents who vote for him because within a few short months, you're seeing so many people get fired at the federal level, hundreds of thousands of jobs are being lost or had been lost. And I think it was just shy of 100,000 to be exact. But then when you factor in probably over the course of this first term, now you're seeing, again, as I mentioned earlier, federal layoffs because of this shutdown. But there was a poll that CNN did that every government shutdown since 1995 that has occurred, Republicans have been mostly to blame for those shutdowns. And that is an interesting fact. But also to the point of, as I was mentioning, I wanted to get your thoughts on this. When you look at education or higher education, universities, colleges, when you look at corporations, and then when you look at our political system, all departments across the board, the White House, Senate, the US House of Representatives, when you look at those entities, I don't know if the best and brightest are representing our states or our districts in this country. The US House of Representatives, the US Senate. I don't believe the best and brightest are. I mean, not across the board, but I think that there's a lot of people who are not qualified, right? And I think that that could be said whether you're a Democrat, Republican, or independent, people are going to have their own opinions. But what are your thoughts on how the standard of measurement is different when it comes to people who are serving in our political system versus people who are, you're a professor, right? I know that we are meeting for the first time in my interview and our on our podcast interview, but I looked at your resume and you're very accomplished and just knowing the work that you've discussed. And I would say that you're a very top professor, right? But there's probably a lot of professors, maybe you would say, or throughout your career where you said they're not that great, but they get the job done. And then there could be that could be said about corporations too. Just because someone has a president and CEO title to their name at that given time doesn't mean that they're running their companies as best as they can be. And that's why presidents and CEOs can be replaced by, by board members or board of governors or whomever, right? At a university, board of governors can, make a decision whether a chancellor or a president, right, has to relinquish his or her spot and for, a university or college, let's say, to go a different direction. So would like to get your thoughts on that.
Absolutely. We all know in our various organizations and jobs, there are people who are stellar and incredible and people maybe not so much. I think I would go back to a couple things. Number one, you don't design any organization so that it only succeeds if the best and brightest are running it because you can't guarantee that. So I teach a lot of political risk and you want to make sure that you are organized and structured in such a way that if you are led even by the mediocre, that you'll sustain, you won't implode. So that's number one. And I think that's true with government. Number two, as a political scientist and somebody who loves politics and government, I will say that I think left, right, and center, our public officials get a lot of criticism that's deserved. There are many, many fine public servants. They may not be the best and the brightest, but they absolutely care. They put themselves, their families on the line to serve. We can all disagree and nitpick at what they're doing. And there's a lot of that. I do that on a daily basis. But I think by and large, people are there to serve. But I also think the framers were right. You need to make sure not any one or group of them can get into power in case they have dark ambitions to tyrannize the rest of us. So you absolutely, speaking of political risk, have to guard against that. The third thing I would say is that as somebody who spends a lot of time at Bloomberg and does a lot of managerial organization, Peter Drucker is a name you'll probably remember. And he used to talk about, and I think this is very important. A lot of times when organizations flounder, we blame the people at the top and the people in the organization. And we just imagine that if we replace them, everything's going to correct itself. And the reality he talks about is that's not the case. For the most part, it's not the people, it's the organization and the structure and its ability to keep moving with the times, right? And we have a system here which was designed in the late 1700s and hasn't changed a whole lot structurally since then. So to me, again, yes, there are people who I find objectionable for many reasons, but I would say we spend a lot of time on those people. If we spent even a scintilla of the amount of time on the job in which they are placed and the difficulty of that structure, we might see that there are other avenues to reform. And that's why, for instance, in the academy and even in business, I run a lot of simulations and gameplay game theory is critical because it's hard to be empathetic to the situation and the difficult environment unless you're put in it. And you probably did this at university and in organizations. We do this all the time for organizations, for businesses, for students, because it's easy to criticize from the outside individuals, but harder once you are put in their particular situation. And when you're put there, it's one way for them to see the difficulty of maneuvering through that structure in any way that makes sense in the long term. And so I would say, the more simulations and gameplay we can do with people on the government and in organizations, the better off we would be in terms of reimagining how to move forward. So I do give a lot of credit, as I have never run for office and I am fully not equipped, to every single person. And the way you get better people in is you encourage more people to do it and make the structure safe for them and their families to do it. And right now, Garrett, quite frankly, it is not a safe environment. I mean, I'm in the media, you're in the media. It's not a safe environment for young people with families and other things. We need to change that. Otherwise, the best and the brightest will, in the interest of themselves and their families, like you, and I don't know if you've run or not, but many of them choose not to run and serve because it's so dangerous and it's so debilitating to a family. And that to me is one thing we can work on. Better pay. I know people hate when I say that, but yes, better pay and more support for our people who choose to do the really hard work that the millions of us depend on.
Yes, and I agree with what you're saying completely. I mean, I was freshman class president in student
Oh,
government my freshman year in college.
go Garrett.
And yeah, and I loved it so much. And it was when I was at UNC Charlotte. So I transferred to UNC after my freshman year because I wanted to go to UNC. I was a big sports guy growing up, so I loved that UNC.
I
Big
can
Michael.
tell behind you.
Yes, yes, absolutely. Big Michael Jordan fan. I have a picture with him above my right shoulder. So I I met him 20 years ago, and that was before I went to UNC. But I want to go to UNC because of the rich tradition in basketball, also the amazing top tier academics, and the fact that it was a college town, opposed to when UNC Charlotte at the time was more of a commuter school, and also because of the award winning top journalism school in the country and the world, the Huston School of Journalism and Media, where people like Pamela Brown or Kayla Tausche or Brooke Baldwin or Stuart Scott have come from the same journalism school. And so I look at, the future like you, just hopeful, but also knowing that there should be a real serious look of how, to your point, reimagine democracy or looking at our institutions, how can we make them either tighter or how can we make them where they're a little bit more fluid, not compromising any of the structural components, but allowing there to be more fluidity or a nicer flow from you talk about managerial organizational leadership skills that you have, but from an organizational standpoint, how could you make government more efficient? How can you make it run better? And I understand that Elon Musk came up with the idea of Department of Government Efficiency, but at the end of the day, how much money was saved at the federal level still pales into comparison of the $37 trillion of debt that our country is now facing and continues to rise in that amount of debt that we just continue to accumulate every year. I wanted to talk about the work that you're most proud of as a professor and that at the Harvard Kennedy School, and mention for my audience at home the other entities that you're involved with and the work that you're doing, and that, what your final message is on relationship building and how relationship building is really what we need, as we look to the future, because history has repeated itself in a positive sense of where relationship building has allowed, whether it's allowed countries to go through nation building, where it's allowed cities to be born and to grow and to house millions of people from all walks of life, to be the engines of our economy. Small businesses is still the two-thirds of our economy. That how we can, as a nation of immigrants, that in a legalized fashion, comprehensive immigration form is important, but that we as a society, through relationship building, which I like to call as the essence of humanity, is what is necessary to move forward as a society. So I'd love to get your thoughts on that and the great work that you do as a professor and at Bloomberg.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. It's hard. You're hard pressed. It's such an important issue that you raised in all of your entire show and every episode. And I listen to them, Garrett. about relationships. I don't think any of us could say we would get to where we are without forming relationships. And I can just tell you, just in the media aspect of my work, every single job I have gotten has been through building relationships. I've been at this for God knows decades. And it was through meeting bookers, meeting anchors, meeting reporters. And, like everything else, these are small communities and you go from one station to the next to the next. And those relationships have been critical. And, just like I was saying, I have a lot of affinity for our public officials. I have to tell you, based on my limited experience, it's not so limited, it's kind of broad. The people I have met in the media world, behind the scenes, in front of the camera, 99.9% of them have been absolutely generous, caring, smart, wonderful, open people. Otherwise, I wouldn't do it, right? I wouldn't do it. It has been such an important aspect of my life, and I'm so grateful now to be at Bloomberg. I've been there for years, but it's all about relationships. That's true every capacity of my life. And I think that's so true again to try to teach our children the importance of relationships. And I do worry about the fact that so much of us spend so much time alone with our screens, and I'm guilty of this, that we sort of have lost sight of some of that. And I think there's a hunger for that. And I think in part that's why so many of my students and other young people were attracted to people like Charlie Kirk, was because he offered a community and a sense of that. So I think that's something, it's so important, the work you're doing, to talk about how important this is. And I think for me, the work I'm most proud of, well, I'm always in the moment, Garrett. So I've got a book that I'm working on right now that I'm really excited about. It has been incredibly wonderful to be at the Ash Center. There are so many just incredibly talented and smart researchers there and scholars working on my, what I'm so passionate about, which is democracy and how to make it better. So I'm very excited about this book that I'm hoping I'll finish, knock on wood. But I think, another a book I had out last year, or the year before, focused on a pre-partition leader on the subcontinent of India, Sikandar Hayat Khan. And that book I'm terribly proud of, because I think so often we get caught in the moment to look at an example like Sir Sikandar, who was somebody who was deeply committed to self-determination for the people of the subcontinent. Like the US, they were colonized. And he had a very different vision of moving forward for the subcontinent than people like Gandhi and others. So I was so honored to be able to put together this book, and it contained his primary papers. And he, I believe, was murdered in the end, but it is just an incredible story. So that work I'm very proud of. And, the media stuff, it's, you try on a daily basis to say something, and I'm just deeply grateful to everybody at Bloomberg, especially Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lyons, because those folks talk to me every day, and, they're wonderful. And we, like everybody else, struggle. Well, I struggle to keep up with what's going on in the moment. So by the time we're off in a minute, Garrett, I'll go on in like an hour and things will have changed completely. So but it's exciting and I love it. But thank you so much for having me. It's really been lovely to talk to you, and keep up the good work. It's important.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jeanne Sheehan Zaino, for being my 93rd guest on the WaveCapital's guest speaker series on relationship building in a team environment. It means so much to me for us to have this candid, in-depth conversation, so informative for my audience and me at home, and I hope for you as well. And really enjoyed our discussion. We've covered so many important topics that our country and our world face today. And as you point out, in an hour when you go back on Bloomberg, and it doesn't take much every week, month, year in this country. I mean, we're the center of it all, and we are the greatest country in the world. And we're definitely going through some dark chapters, and we've gone through dark chapters in the past. But I do believe that there is light at the end of the tunnel. We are still the shining city on a hill, and that we will be okay. And yeah, I would love to run for political office in the future, having that experience at the collegiate level in student government. I believe that I would be remiss if I didn't share that with you. I would love to do it in the future, but as my wife and I are growing our young family, our son's turning 3 years old this November 4th. And then, we have our second child on the way. And I do hope that, they grow up in a world where it is more peaceful, it is safe, it is calm, it's productive, prosperous, and that through relationship building, I believe that all things are possible for our country and for the rest of the world if we just do it together.
I couldn't agree more. And I could see the budding politician in you, Garrett. So I am not surprised. And, I wish you and your wife all the best. And happy birthday to your baby boy, 3 years old on November 4th. That's don't those moments, as I can tell you, I have two sons who are grown men, and God, it goes by fast. Everybody says it, but boy, is it true. In the moment, it feels like it's going by very slowly sometimes, but God, they get old quickly. So enjoy it.
Yes, and I'm sure you're a very proud mom, and congratulations on your 2 sons, who are now of adult age, and I'm sure they're doing amazing things for the
Yeah,
world.
they are. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.